Okay. Well, I would like to welcome everybody who has come tonight. And I speak on behalf of the Continuing Ed Committee at First Parish. Our speaker for tonight, Stephen Frail, will be sharing his knowledge and background on the Needham Climate Action Plan. And it's very exciting that we have this happening in Needham. And I also want to give a special thanks to Eleanor Rossellini, who has really been the person who got this all happening. And so we're thrilled to sponsor this tonight. And Lyceums have a long history in New England as being a place where ideas that matter can be shared, discussed, and debated. Our Lyceum is named in honor of the late Reverend Ed Lane, who was a beloved member of First Parish. And the Lane Lyceums is a reflection of Ed's lifelong passion for and commitment to civil rights, equal justice, and spiritual inquiry. Before turning this over to the evening presentation, I would like everybody to mute themselves if you haven't already. And also, if you would like to be on our mailing list for the Lane Lyceums, and that would be the only time we would use the emails, you can put your email in the chat, or you can email me directly with it. And so we can include you on upcoming Lyceums. We have a number of them planned for the beginning of the year. We also, Stephen asked that you put questions in the chat, and there will be a break partway through. So we can take questions on the first part of the presentation at that time, and then we will have opportunities for questions at the end as well. But it does make sense, especially with so many people on, for people to put them in the chat. And so without further ado, I welcome everyone, and I turn it over to Eleanor. Thank you so much.
Hello, thank you for coming. I'm Eleanor Rossellini, and I'm chair of the Green Congregation Committee here at First Parish. And I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Stephen Frail. Stephen not only strives for the green lifestyle, he's also stepped up to take responsibility and leadership roles in climate action. About 5 years ago, Stephen began giving talks about climate change after being trained in Al Gore's Climate Reality Project. And he's been serving on the Green Needham Steering Committee for 4 years, and he is now the chair of the town of Needham's Climate Action Plan Committee. And just on a personal note, I've worked with Stephen for 4 years in Green Needham, and I do think about passing the baton from my generation to the next. And I just want to say how grateful I am to have passionate and pragmatic people like Stephen who are on my team and coming to carry things forward. So Stephen, thank you for everything you do and for helping to lead us into a better future. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. That was a lovely introduction. And I would like to just return the favor, because Eleanor is actually one of the first people in Needham that I started talking to when I became more active on climate issues. In fact, it was at First Parish, I think we met at there was a presentation, and I can't remember the presenter, maybe you do, Eleanor, but it was focusing on how do you focus on self-care as a climate activist. How do you deal with the feeling of we're never going to get there, and the problem's too big to solve. And it was a very moving presentation. I'm sure a number of people on the line were there as well. I've kept the lessons of that with me along the way, because it's felt like we've needed it at times. But I feel like we're really in an exciting time now, because we're sort of turning the corner, hopefully, to much broader action on climate change. And it's a thrill to be here talking to you about Needham's Climate Action Plan. It was one of the first things that I was hoping the town would do several years ago. I don't think we had as much reception towards the idea of a town taking action on climate as we do today. And so the select board chartered this committee last year, and we started working earlier this spring. So I'm very excited to talk about it. I also just want to acknowledge, I've seen a lot of the names on the line here. There's a lot of people on this line who've been active in climate in Needham much longer than I have, and who are also participating on this Climate Action Plan Committee. I want you to know that this is actually a big, giant collective effort. And though I'm speaking to you, I'm not taking credit for it. There's many people working on this. So I'm going to give you two presentations today. The first is, what is our Climate Action Plan Committee working on? What's our process, our workflow, and our timeline? I'm going to pause after that, and I'm going to give people an opportunity to ask any questions about that. It is meant to be an inclusive process. So though there is a committee, and you'll hear a little bit about working groups later, we're also hoping for a lot of interaction in the community. And this is actually our first public, besides our actual committee meetings, this is our first public outreach as a committee. So I want to thank the Lane Lyceum for being the one that invited us to this. In the second half of our talk, after a little break for Q&A, we'll talk about the first action that has been adopted by the town, and that's pursuing a community electricity aggregation for the town of Needham. And we'll talk about that as well. So first, I just wanted to introduce you to the Climate Action Planning Committee. There are 7 permanent members of the committee plus 2 select board members. So our select board representation is Marianne Cooley and Kevin Keene. As I mentioned, the committee was formed this spring, but it was adopted as a goal last year. And the select board, actually prompted by organizations like Green Needham and League of Women Voters and other citizen groups, heard the call for a climate action plan and answered the bell. And so you can see the names. Myself and Nick Hill are both members of Green Needham, but we have Dr. Paul Della Ripa, who's been involved in a number of projects, including our Solarize program in Needham. Artie Crocker, I think most people know from his activities in Needham, including his work in the solar industry. Natasha Espada is an award-winning architect. Rachel Bright works in consulting, and Joe Higgins is at MIT. So that's the committee that has been meeting. And we're also supported by several members of the town staff. Hank Half, who's Director of Design and Construction. Cecilia Simchak, who's our Director of Finance and Administration and Public Services, and then Catherine Copley, who's been helping on the administrative side. They work very hard. They're hugely knowledgeable about what we're doing. And one of the things that has been really exciting for me on the committee is to see how much commitment within our town staff, and that goes right up to our town manager, Kate Fitzpatrick, there is for adopting actions around climate change. So why are we here? I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but climate change is real and it is here. It is bad. It is caused by humans, and we need to act. So that's why we're here. In fact, it's so urgent that Massachusetts has committed the state to acting on this, adopting greenhouse gas emissions actions across the state. So as I mentioned, the select board established it last year, and our charter is to develop a plan that meets or exceeds the state's climate mitigation and resilience goals. So what's causing climate change? Very simply, this is a review, I think, for many people, but I'm going to go through it anyway, just in case it's anyone's in need of a refresher. So greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, but also methane and other gases emitted from the burning of fossil fuels and other human activities are warming our planet. And that's moving us out of a narrow temperature band that we've been in for centuries, actually thousands of years. And the mechanism is something that's been understood for well over 100 years. So the sun emits radiation. It comes in the form of light waves that passes into our atmosphere. And most of this radiation is absorbed by the earth and warms it, which is great, because otherwise we'd be a big giant ice ball and we wouldn't be here. But a lot of that energy also is radiated back into space, and it goes out as infrared waves. Also good, because if too much of that energy was absorbed, we'd become a giant desert. So we've been in a nice Goldilocks zone for our species. There has always been at least during human existence, a layer of the atmosphere that traps some of that infrared radiation and keeps us in that narrow band. But what has been happening over the past century is that we've been increasingly filling that atmosphere with these greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, we are now putting 142 million tons of those gases into the atmosphere every 24 hours, basically treating our atmosphere like an open sewer. And as a result, that atmosphere is getting thicker. So those greenhouse gases, they trap that infrared energy and things have been getting warmer. And so that's the simple mechanism. I use the analogy of one of those neck pillows that you can put in a microwave and heat it up. And those little beads inside the neck pillow, you put it on your shoulder and now you're nice and warm. That's essentially what the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas molecules are doing in our atmosphere. They're trapping that heat and keeping the planet warmer. So the biggest sources of greenhouse gas are in our petroleum industry, our air transport, but we also know about the loss of forest around the world, crop burning, fertilization, our industrial agriculture and industrial processes are all spewing the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Coal plants as well, coal plants and natural gas plants for our electricity are other big sources. And then of course, transportation, our personal transportation, and as well as the transportation of goods and services. So what does Needham's greenhouse gas emissions look like? So I'm going to give you a couple of pictures of it just so you're aware. So this is all of the greenhouse gas emissions. We did actually Green Needham spurred the development of a greenhouse gas emissions inventory and looked at all sectors. So the biggest sectors for our greenhouse gas emissions come from our passenger vehicles, about a quarter, residential buildings, just over a third, and then our commercial and industrial buildings, which is another roughly third of the total greenhouse gas emissions. There are other vehicles, transportation, construction, as well as waste that contribute additional percentage points. One thing I want to call out here is in the bottom left. The town of Needham itself, so when you think about the schools, the town hall, our fleet vehicles, comprise only about 2.5% of all of Needham's greenhouse gas emissions. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, I think often when we think about the town acting, we think about what is the town going to do about the school buildings and the buses and the things of those nature. Well, yes, there's definitely some actions the town can do to reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions. But if we're to succeed at stopping the global warming that has been happening, it's going to require action from all sectors, private, public, as well as businesses and individuals. So that's what this slide really is the key takeaway. We were going to require a collective mobilization to address this. So where is that greenhouse gas coming from in each of those sectors? The largest source today of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our heat and heating systems. So our home heating, business heating, as well as public buildings. The second largest comes from gasoline and diesel in our transportation. So our personal cars, our buses, our trucks. delivery vans. And then the third largest comes from our electricity. So the power coming into our homes is largely generated through the burning of fossil fuels. There's some other sectors, construction is one of them, but the big three are our heating, our transportation fuels, and our electricity sources. The basic formula for getting to net zero as a society is first to electrify everything. So anything that is running on fossil fuels today, like a car, truck, a lawnmower, or a furnace, our goal is to electrify that. So to move it off of burning the fossil fuels. And then the second thing is to ensure that we green the electricity grid. There's a little bit more to the calculation than this, but if we could get everything to be electric and then green the grid itself, make it all renewable and non-fossil fuel, we can get to net zero. We have the technology to do that. And what that would look like over time is between today and 2050, we would see each of those sectors start to become less and less intensive on greenhouse gas emissions. Some things are easier to do than others. For example, it's probably easier today to green our electricity grid than it is to get everybody to switch their furnaces over to heat pumps. And that's because the grid has a scale and can switch from one source to another if the economics are right. Meanwhile, people don't replace their furnaces every year. We probably have to wait to the end of life of a furnace before it gets replaced. And so you would see some sectors like the electricity sector can rapidly become decarbonized, whereas the building sector is going to take longer to decarbonize. Transportation is another sector that it's going to take a while because people don't replace their vehicles but every few years. But the general trajectory would be, let's get to net zero by 2050. So I'm going to talk really briefly about the climate action plan process, how we've been working so far and what our timeline is. So our first meeting was in March of this year. We started by drafting an outline and a project plan. And we began meeting with some of the senior staff in town, as well as other committees and boards, to get a little bit of buy-in for the process. And we started doing some presentations to other committees and boards in early fall. The most recent thing we've done is we formed some working groups, and the working groups are going to look at the major areas. I'll get on the next slide. Major areas of actions that we can take as a town to reduce our carbon footprint. And those working groups were formed from across the town. So we're now in the phase where those working groups have begun meeting. In fact, Eleanor just came from one of her meetings earlier today. The goal is by the end of the year or early January, those working groups will have a set of actions that they will recommend back to the Climate Action Plan Committee. We will then work as a committee to help prioritize and finalize those actions. And we were also recently funded by the town to hire a professional consultant who is going to help with a lot of the technical analysis, including evaluating different pathways to net zero for the town and helping us to refine our proposals around which actions would have the biggest impact for the investment we'd have to put into them so we can sequence them correctly. And then what are the potential implementation pathways for those? So we're going to get some professional advice on how to build an implementation plan for each of the actions. Once that work is complete, we'll begin drafting the actual climate action plan. And that'll be in January 2023. We'll be running that by the select board, and there'll be, at that point, an increase in public outreach to get feedback and answer questions about our plan. The overall goal is to get to a final climate action plan in the first half of 2023, so that we can start to begin implementation of specific actions in the latter half of 2023. I won't go into the detail, but there are a lot of funding sources today for climate actions, both from the state and the federal. So there have been a number of state laws that have passed in recent years, including one just this past congressional past session that put a lot of emphasis on things like heat pumps, electric vehicles, and other electrification programs at the state level. And then those of you who heard about the Inflation Reduction Act that passed in DC this year, that has an additional layer of incentives around that. So both the state and the federal are putting out tremendous amount of incentives today for individuals, organizations, businesses, municipalities to adopt climate action plans and reduce their carbon footprint. So it's important for us to get to a final plan next year, so we're in a good position to take advantage of those incentives. So I mentioned there's working groups. We have 6, and these map roughly to the big sectors that I was showing earlier in the slide around where our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. So transportation is one working group. They'll be looking at ways that we can create incentives and push both the town as well as town residents and businesses to adopt zero emissions vehicles. Nick Hill is chairing the clean energy supply. So this gets at things like how do we shift our electricity supply from one that's focused on is primarily natural gas to one that's greener. Artie Crocker is chairing the working group on natural resources and zero waste. So how do we reduce waste? One of the biggest sources of emissions today is actually food waste. So if you think about food, the carbon intensity of food from the farm to your table and then into the waste stream, there's carbon that's emitted throughout the entirety of that that life cycle of food. And so how do we reduce that as town? How do we reduce waste? But also natural resources. How do we protect things like our wetlands and our trees that are carbon sinks in town? Joe Higgins is focusing on the net zero buildings. So this is largely focused on the electrification of heat and decarbonization of cooling, as well as building efficiency. So that's actually a huge prerequisite for electrification, because natural gas tends to be, at least currently, less expensive to heat than electric, even with heat pumps. It is essential that we make buildings and homes as efficient as possible as we shift over to the heat pumps. That will both reduce the amount of energy that's used and therefore the amount of potential carbon that's used, but it also lower bills for homeowners. Natasha is chairing the Climate Smart and Zoning and Permitting group, and that's looking at what are the regulatory changes we can make in town that can help facilitate adoption of net zero reducing technologies. So a good example of that is there's actually for past couple of years been strong interest from the school committee in putting solar canopies up over parking lots in Needham. However, those parking lots are not zoned for solar canopies. So one easy fix for that is to change the zoning so that by right they don't need a special permit. They can put those solar canopies on. From a housing perspective as well, there are changes that could be made to things like the setbacks for certain types of equipment like heat pumps, as well as the height restrictions around things like solar, rooftop solar and or small wind electricity turbines. So that will be those will be some of the things that might be considered by that group. And then lastly, Rachel is chairing a group on governance. And so this focuses on things like how do we ensure there's transparency, equity, and fairness in the town's climate action plan? How do we hold the town accountable for the reductions that we're seeking? as well as how do we make sure that we're communicating these plans broadly and across all stakeholder groups in town. So once the working groups have got involved, I mentioned we've already started doing interactions with town staff and boards, but these working groups will be providing their recommendations back to the Climate Action Committee. There might be some back and forth there as the Climate Action Plan Committee tries to understand what the recommendations are and feed them into the broader Climate Action Plan development. We'll be running public hearings, soliciting feedback, and issuing calls to action to the broader community as that plan is being developed as well. And then ultimately we'll have a final action plan that is presented and reviewed by boards, town staff, and then specific actions can begin to be implemented. One thing that I want to underscore is that the Climate Action Plan Committee and the Climate Action Plan itself are advisory. So none of the actions that we are putting forth in the plan are mandatory for the town to take on. Every single action will have to go through the standard town decision-making process and prioritization, which means if it needs to go to the select board or the planning board first, if it needs a public hearing, if it needs town meeting authorization, it'll go through all of those standard processes before it can actually be implemented. Our goal is really to help provide the roadmap, the prioritization, and the information that those boards and the town meeting need in order to make the types of decisions they need to make on an annual basis. So I'm going to pause right there before we go into the next topic to see if anybody has any questions so far about our Climate Action Plan Committee and our process. So I'll pause. I can't quite see any of the chats right now. I don't know if there's any questions. There are no questions in the chat yet. When I pause for a second, and if you want to type a question in the chat, or if you want to ask a question, this would be a good time to chime in.
Stephen, I'd like to ask, I haven't typed it in, but I'm unmuted, so I will just ask you. Are you doing any work with other communities, or sharing resources or ideas? Is there any of that cross-town work being done?
Yeah, great question, Amy. Quite a bit. In fact, the process and template that we've used for organizing our Climate Action Plan Committee came from Wellesley. And so I had several conversations with the sustainability coordinator there, Mary Beth Martello. She provided a lot of resources, a lot of guidance, and we spoke with a number of other towns as well. And when I say we, there's actually several ways that was happening. So there were people in the Climate Action Plan Committee doing it. We had an intern over the summer, Andy Atala, who's a student at Middlebury, and he did a lot of outreach. And then Green Needham has done quite a bit of that as well. And so all of that funneled into the organizational. On another layer, there is, we've been consulting the climate action plans of all the other towns. So one thing that I think I've heard said a number of times is that you're not going to come up with a new climate action plan that hasn't already been adopted. It's going to be flavored like Needham, but it's going to look a lot like Wellesley's and Acton's and Concord's and Arlington's. And so we're trying not to reinvent the wheel, but we are trying to make sure that the process is inclusive and focused on the specific needs of Needham and the pathways that Needham can best take to reach net zero. We also have a number of professionals that we've been engaging with. So there's the Green Energy Consumer Alliance has provided a lot of assistance along the way. There's organizations like Power Options, Beth Greenblatt, who's one of the consultants that the town has worked with and over the years, have all brought additional expertise into the process. And then through the working groups, their working groups are really encouraged to reach out beyond their membership, however that might mean. So that might be to other people in town or people across borders.
Great.
There may be opportunities as well in the future in specific actions to collaborate with other towns on actions where we might be able to work together. So quite a bit of coordination.
Great. Got a couple other questions. Which group is addressing light pollution? Lots of waste going up into the sky and onto neighboring property.
Right. So waste reduction would be in the natural resources and waste reduction, the one that Artie Crocker and actually Eleanor Rossellini is a member of that group. The one thing that I want to be clear about is that our charter is really focused on greenhouse gas reduction. So light pollution that is from incandescent bulbs or lights that don't necessarily need to be on, that could be a good type of action that would fit in our scope. Lights that have to be on, however, and are probably already LED, as most of the street lights are in Needham today. That project was completed in the last couple of years. That would not be directly in the scope. So light pollution is something that is a problem. There are a lot of problems. I think pesticide use is a good example, is a problem, but it's not necessarily directly related to the charter of the Climate Action Plan Committee.
Right.
So we have to be rather narrowly scoped in what we're trying to do.
Okay. Another question. Are there lists of people involved with each of the working groups?
There are. I'm not sure if we put them on a public site, but it is information that can be shared readily. And I can probably, as a follow-up action, put it up on the Needham. There is a climate action plan page on the Needham website.
Okay.
It might be a good place for me to put that. So it's a good question.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder about the feasibility of putting solar panels over parking lots, for example, the CVS parking lot. Should I write to someone who is heading a subcommittee? Also, I wonder about requiring new renovations and new buildings in residences to require solar panels where feasible.
Yep.
Should I address that to the subcommittee on zoning?
Those are both great questions. So the feasibility of putting solar panels over parking lots, I do think that that's something that's going to come up in the context of making solar canopies something that's a by right and doesn't require a special permit. I don't know when that's going to come forward, but it's something that's been discussed. And then there are limits to what we can require. So when you talk about requiring new renovations in buildings to have solar panels where feasible, that gets into an area of jurisdiction that is claimed by the state, and that's the building codes. And so there are building codes. We have a stretch building code adopted in Needham already, which is going to be updated next year and is going to increase the efficiency of homes that are built or renovated after it goes into effect next year. There's also something called a specialized code. It's a new code. And this code is still being finalized by the state, but when it is finalized, towns and cities that adopt it, it has even stricter requirements for efficiency. And then it has some requirements making buildings either electric only, or if they're going to have fossil fuels, they need to be even more efficient and be solar ready if that's something that's feasible given the location and the roof.
Right.
So that's definitely something that is under consideration. Town meeting would have to opt into the specialized code, however. Okay. So, and that's probably not going to happen early in 2023.
Okay. And I apologize to Neil. I missed your question completely. Are you working with the T for electrification of the trains?
So we have not worked with the MBTA. The other piece of the sort of the scoping that we have is that we really need to focus on things that Needham can impact. And so we can certainly always reach out and lobby and advocate for electrification of trains, but it's not something that Needham is actually going to be able to directly act upon itself. So I am sure that there's going to be a component of the plan that will be advocacy for programs at the state level, changes at the state level that we can make. But it's probably not going to be like one of the top actions for us. I agree, though, that I would love to see those trains be electric.
Yeah.
Diesel doesn't make any sense.
Okay. And I think the last one, the town put out a request to bid to supply, oops, I'm sorry, this jumps, to supply fossil fuel for Emery Grover, Hillside, and I'm not sure. Would it be part of a plan to stop buying fossil fuels?
So within the context of the building, the net zero building working group, there could be a recommendation that comes out to this that says we should only be on town property putting in electric only. The timing is something that would be, open for debate. So when do we do that? Emery Grover has certainly going to be a lot greener than it was prior to the renovation. The entire envelope is going to be much tighter. I believe they're trying to put heat pumps in there. I don't know if they're going to have how much fossil fuels they're going to have overall there, but they're looking at it. And I know that Hank Half has been talking with consultants and other experts in town on how can we more effectively adopt net zero, either net zero or greener solutions to heating and cooling in our municipal buildings. The challenge right now is that we don't have a directive at the town level to do that. And so, the buildings department, the permanent public building committee doesn't have the charter today to say, hey, we're only going to look at electric only. That could be something that comes out of the climate action plan. And it could be something, if we do that, that the select board would have to adopt, and potentially town meeting, because there could be a financial component there that impacts building construction.
Okay. Under the Mass Climate Law passed this year, 10 cities and towns can prohibit fossil fuels in all new construction. We're too late to be one of those 10, but are we considering applying to be in the next set if the law is expanded?
Again, that might come out, that would probably come out from the zoning committee. It would require public hearings, right? We'd have to go through the whole process, because that could have a big impact on individuals, and we have to think about low income housing. I can tell you that the Needham Housing Authority, which is looking to rebuild some of the properties in town, is looking to have electric only heating and cooling and cooking in those units. And there's a lot of funding, as I mentioned, to help support that at the state, the federal level. So I don't know whether or not we would be one of the first groups to get into that. We're definitely not the 10. There's also the possibility that with the new administration coming into the State House, that they may revisit those building codes. So those building codes were developed under the current administration, the Baker administration, which has been probably listening a little bit more to the utilities, including the fossil fuel lobbyists in the state. I don't know if Governor-elect Healy is going to reopen that in the new year, but I've heard some rumors that they may. And if that were to happen, again, it would have to go through the town meeting. Town meeting would have to adopt any different building codes. It would have to go through the whole standard process.
Okay, and one final question. Is there another single entity that produces more than 2.4% of total GHG? Might not the town be the largest generator of GHGs?
Yeah, that's the town, I believe, I don't know this for sure, but I do believe it's the largest single generator because we have so many properties, right? And so even though it's only 2.5%, it's an important 2.5%, for two reasons. One, it's a large chunk of the 100 that we need to get rid of. But it's also it's a signaling mechanism. So if the town is able to decarbonize our schools, our town hall, our transportation, and eventually things like plows and construction equipment, that would show a path towards others that need to follow the same path, right? So there's probably a really good signaling mechanism for the town to do that, and so certainly looking to prioritize that.
Right, okay. And I think we'll make this the last question. How do we as a community monitor our progress on these initiatives in a quantitative way?
Great question. So the first thing is we do now have a baseline for our greenhouse gas emissions. Right? That gives us something to measure against. And the plan would be to update that at a regular interval and see what sort of progress we're making. So if we are able to implement actions that are significant, we can then look back after a year or two and determine whether or not we're making progress towards our goals. The other piece of this is transparency and governance. So that's why we have a working group focusing exclusively on that component, because what we do want is we want to have a mechanism to show our progress to the community, which might be in the form of a dashboard on our website, or an annual report, much in the way that those of you who get your school department reports on an annual basis and peruse it. So there's certainly a lot of reporting we can do. We do have a baseline, long way to go, and we want to figure out a way to communicate that.
Right.
All right.
Okay, so let's move on to the second part. This is great.
Yeah, great questions, all of you. So we're going to talk about the first action that came out of the town meeting. The Climate Action Plan Committee. So this action was one that was, I guess, so immediately achievable with low investment for the town and such a big impact that we decided to not even wait for the Climate Action Plan to be developed to recommend it. And so I'll get into the process for how we went through that in a minute, but let me first tell you what it is for those who've never heard of Community Electricity Aggregation. So very simply, this is a mechanism by which the town can pool the purchasing power of many, many, many small consumers. So there's a Massachusetts general law that authorizes any town or city to aggregate the electrical load of interested electricity consumers within its boundaries. That's a fancy way of saying the town can negotiate on behalf of everybody in Needham for better rates and better, greener electricity. That's the whole idea of the law. And what it's designed to do is essentially give the small consumer the same type of power that big consumers typically have. So the town of Needham can negotiate with utilities, for power providers, to get a contract for a certain period of time, 2 or 3 years, for example, and do that on its own without this law. A business like TripAdvisor can do the same. Olin College can do the same. They have a big enough load that they can go out and ask electricity providers to bid on their business, on their electricity consumption. Most of us don't fall into those camps. Like, my electricity is far too small to do that. I could ask people to bid on me, they would ignore me. But if Needham goes to these utilities, they can negotiate on my behalf and then offer me the rate that is negotiated. So it has 3 goals. One is the leveling the playing field, which I'm talking about. It's essentially the small consumer gets buying power that they otherwise would not have. And with that buying power, they can accomplish 2 other goals. They can stabilize the electricity costs. As most of you know, the electricity rates seem to be spiking again. A feature of community electricity aggregation is you have a level price for several years. typically 3 years. And then also you can reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. And that's because when you negotiate, you can ask for specific things. Like, for example, today, 20% of our electricity comes from fossil fuels. I'm sorry. 20% of our electricity comes from renewable energy. In a CEA, you can ask for more. You could ask for 25% or 30% or even more. You might not like the rates that come with it, but you can ask for it and see what people are willing to bid. And those are the two primary goals. So I was mentioning that roughly about 20% today are coming from renewable energy. So there's class 1 renewables, which are things like wind, solar, and then other sources like hydroelectric power. Fossil fuel, for example, you can see is one of the largest sources of our electricity today, about 40%, followed by 29% gasoline and diesel, oil, so to speak. And then there's some other other generations of electricity in the market. So only about a quarter is coming from the renewables today, and we'd like to see if we can increase that. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, just a lesson about the electricity market. I think most of you who are aware of the deregulation that happened a few decades ago, actually, electricity was broken into two components: the supplier who's generating the electricity, and then the delivery. And today, if you haven't done anything like looked for another supplier, most people are getting both their electricity supply and their delivery from Eversource. So if you've ever looked at your electricity bill, you see it's the price is actually, your bill is actually broken into two components. And if Eversource is your supplier, you see it in both buckets. Most people never shop around. Most people just take what Eversource gives them. And so they're getting about, as I said, 20% of their electricity is coming from renewable sources, and it's being delivered on Eversource lines, and they're paying the bills. Now, some people have probably been aware that you can go shopping for other electricity suppliers. There's a energy switch ma.gov is a website that allows you to do this. In fact, my wife and I have shopped on this before, and we're currently in another supplier's contract, which ends this month. You can basically go through a bunch of different options and look at how much renewable energy do you want, how long of a term do you want. You can look at it by price. You can look at it by whether or not there's a cancellation fee. You shop for things, and then once you decide which one you want, you sign basically agreement. What happens is, what you move from is Eversource supplying you to maybe another provider. So it could be a provider, Power Mass, or Constellation, or Clean Source Energy. There's a variety of different electricity suppliers. But Eversource is still delivering your bill. They're still bringing that electricity to your house. They're still the ones that you call if you have a problem with your electricity. You are, however, as an individual consumer, really limited to what's in that marketplace. So earlier I was talking about the ability to negotiate with suppliers. You can't do that in this marketplace. You can basically take what they're offering or stick with what you've got. So how does the CEA work? It's a little bit different. What the CEA is doing is going to pool the purchasing power of consumers and then contract with a different supplier. So the CEA would switch for everybody who stays within the CEA, the Community Electricity Aggregation. And we can green the power, and we can look at a contract that stabilizes electricity costs over that time. So a typical Community Electricity Aggregation agreement stabilizes for 2 or 3 or 4 years. The yellow line, if you're looking at this is just a representation. It's actual data, but it's representation of the Eversource basic service. So if you never change your electricity bill, you'll see it go up and down. It tends to go up in the winter when days are shorter, we're using more electricity, and it drops again in the spring. But over time, it typically has been going up. And that's as commodity prices increase, electricity prices increase, inflation increases as well. Meanwhile, if you're in an aggregation agreement, because it is a contract that is set at a specific price, it's flat over several years. And so this shows two different back-to-back CEA agreements. This again is real data from another town. I can't remember exactly which town it was. But you'll see because the rate for the basic service goes up and down, it sometimes dips below the contract price and then sometimes goes above the contract price. Historically, on average, it's been above the contract prices more than it's below it. And that's because, again, commodity prices have generally been rising. Most towns that have been in CEAs have opted to renew those CEAs. So the CEA locks that rate in, and then a town may continue with a contract. So from an electricity service perspective, as I mentioned, Eversource is still the deliverer of the electricity. They still maintain the power lines, they provide the customer service, and they send the bills to consumers. The only thing that changes is the electricity supply. So a community electricity aggregation usually offers consumers who are in it 3 tiers. So there's usually a basic tier, and that just meets the state's minimum green electricity standard. Effectively, it's the same as Eversource's basic service. It might be a different rate. It could be a lower rate than Eversource's basic service. The one difference that is a for sure is that it's going to be stable over the course of the contract, whereas Eversource's may go up or down in that time. There's usually a default rate, which is on average about 5 or 10% more green electricity to basic. 5 to 10% seems to have historically been the amount of incrementally greener electricity that can be added to the program at a price that's still competitive with Eversource's basic rate. So most towns we see are in that 5 to 10% range. And then there's usually a opt-up amount. This has in some towns been up to 100% renewable electricity. And so everybody would be put into the default category, but some consumers could decide to go down to the basic or go up to the greenest option. So participation in CEA is voluntary, it's not mandatory. The town will negotiate on everybody's behalf. And all Needham residences and businesses, and basically all ratepayers, will be opted into the program automatically, except anybody who decides to opt out. And so what that means is you call, you email, you send a postcard in and say, I don't want to be part of the CEA, and they put you back into the Eversource basic service. Or somebody who decides to go into maybe the energyswitchmass.gov and go to another supplier. Either they're already there or they decide to go there. In both of these situations, they would be out of the CEA, and there's no penalty or cost to those individuals for doing that. The state mandates that anybody can opt out within 808 days, but in practice, all the CEAs in the state that we're aware of allow that for the course of the contract. So over any point over 3 years, if somebody says, I want to be out of the CEA, they can do that. So the other thing is consumers who remain in the CEA can stick with the default product, or they can opt up. So I mentioned they could go into the greenest program, or they can decide to opt down to the basic. Those are the options. So there's over 160 towns today in Massachusetts have CEAs. So we're not the first one here. Newton has one, Acton, Dedham, Natick. So there's quite a few of our peer towns that have had these. Many of these are green in that they offer in the default rate a greener electricity mix than what you can get from Eversource Basic. Some of them are not. Some of them are just trying to get a cheaper rate for their residents. So one of the questions that I've had a number is, will there be opportunity for the public to weigh in? Yes, we're just starting the process. So as I mentioned, we were recently authorized. We first recommended this action to the select board. The select board said, yes, this sounds like something we want to work on. The process to create a CEA starts with the select board submitting a warrant article to town meeting, asking for authorization to begin negotiating a CEA. That was presented at this fall special town meeting. It was adopted, I believe, some close to 240 to 1. So it was almost unanimous, which was thrilling to hear that that level of commitment to the CEA. And so what happens now is that I believe it's beginning of next month, the town is kicking off the process. So there will be an RFQ sent out to solicit bids from consultants, energy consultants who will help us go through all of the steps of first of all, defining what we want in a CEA, what are the target green targets, what are the rate targets. They'll go through all of the steps with us. And that will require by law, public hearings, public comment. Every ratepayer in town has to be contacted by the town before we can adopt a CEA to let them know what their options are. And then there's an opt-out period prior to the beginning of the CEA for anybody who decides they don't want to participate in it, and they'll be left in the Eversource basic rate. There is a Department of Public Utilities hearing as well at the state level. So once the plan is formulated with the consultant, it has to go to the state for review. The state also has a hearing. And so would invite any ratepayers to attend that hearing and provide feedback before weighing in on whether or not they'll approve the CEA for the town of Needham. The whole process takes usually about 18 months to 2 years. So it's a long process. There's a lot of steps that need to be go through by law. And so we've just really gotten to the on-ramp of the CEA so far. So there's a lot more to come on it. I think that's it. That's all on the CEA. So I'll pause there and see if there are additional questions. And we can always go back to other questions about the broader CEA climate action plan if there are any.
Okay, so again, feel free to type in your questions. While we're waiting, Stephen, are there, in towns that have already adopted a CEA, what percentage of people opt out? Is it pretty well supported?
Yeah, it's generally very, I mean, what's helped in recent years is that the overall rates have increased while the CEAs did not. And so most towns have had very high participation rates. I can't give you exact percentages. It does vary. They've had high percentage participation rates, and they've had very high satisfaction with the CEA. We are now in an environment where the rates have spiked dramatically. And so I just saw my contract renewal coming up, and it's doubling for electricity. Wow. So I suspect those who are in CEAs today are going to be very, very happy about it. I think people who may be further along in creating a CEA but haven't started it yet might be having a moment where they might say, why don't we wait for the rates to come back down? Because if the bids are coming in today and they're, very high, let's say 25 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity generation, well, that's twice what it was a year ago. And so they may not want to lock in for 3 years that rate if they think the electricity rates will start coming down. There's been a lot of things that have been driving the cost of electricity. Natural gas prices have been one of the biggest drivers. So there's this little war over in Ukraine, which has cut off a huge section of a huge amount of natural gas to the global economy. That's driven up the commodity prices, and that drives up the electricity prices here. And so there might be some people who want to wait to adopt a CEA.
Sure.
So we hope that by the time our program comes forward, we can get bids that are far more competitive than what we're seeing today.
Okay. Has the committee considered creating a municipal power company such as Wellesley or Peabody?
We have not. I don't really know enough about that topic to know whether or not it's something the town might consider. That's a little bit above my pay grade, but it's, certainly Wellesley's done it. We could always talk to them and see how do they get to that point where they have that. I don't know what the pros and cons are of having your own municipal light company. There actually have been some detriments in Wellesley. I don't know those of you who watched or read the news recently about the town of Wellesley had a new school that was supposed to be net zero. And then National Grid came in and said, hey, we'll give you several $1 million for the new building, but you need to dig gas lines into the school. That created a big fuss and slowed down their process quite a bit. Ultimately, National Grid changed its offer and said, you don't need to dig the gas any longer, because they got a lot of bad press about it. What I understand it was driving the National Grid, if we want to assume innocent intentions, is that Mass Save has a number of incentives for the utilities to go electric only, but it's only available to their customers. And since National Grid, since the Wellesley was not a customer of National Grid couldn't extend those incentives to Wellesley unless they were a paying customer. And so National Grid thought, well, let's make them a paying customer by putting some gas lines in there. They backed off of that.
Okay.
But it's a good question. I'll probably have to just look at, maybe ask some experts. Is it something that should even be considered?
Okay. What kind of structure is there to be for carrying out the negotiations with the electricity provider? Isn't there a potential for conflict of interest between the town and its residents?
So there's a certain process that needs to be adhered to. And so the process includes working with an energy consultant. So the energy consultant is the expert on the power markets. They're the ones that take the town's bid and brings it out to the energy suppliers and solicits bids. There will be criteria that has to be laid out ahead of time as to what the successful bids will look like. Again, the structure of the program itself is going to require public hearings in town to ensure that there's transparency and that there isn't conflict of interest. And the other piece of this is that because the individual consumer always has the right to leave a CEA without penalty or fee, this gives a lot of protection to the individual consumer. There is an incentive for the town and the utility to come up with very competitive rates and a green product to ensure participation. Their assumptions, the price that they're going to bid is going to be assuming a certain participation rate. And so if the product itself is not compelling, people will walk away from it and they won't make the money that they were hoping to make. And the town won't reach the greenhouse gas reduction targets that it hopes to make. So I think there is some natural alignment between the goals of the town, the utility, and the individuals who stand to benefit, hopefully through greener electricity and more stable prices. The other thing is that by law, the town is required to reach every ratepayer with very clear instructions in a very clear specified format about what it is their options are. So that is what the rates are, what the green components are, what the Eversource basic rate is, exactly how they can opt out if they choose to opt out. All of that is required by law. Newton actually has a very nice website that I looked at because they do have a CEA over there. And it's a very clean, very easy to understand website, along with an 800 number if you want to call and talk to somebody live and tell them you want to opt out. There are postcards that they mail to every ratepayer with, if you'd like to opt out, here's your postcard. And then there's an annual reporting requirement as well, which specifies, again, what the rates are, what the green components are, et cetera. We certainly want to be very transparent with this and not try to mislead anybody into a product that they don't want to be in.
Okay. If someone is in a contract when the CEA starts and they have to opt out, can they opt in at a future date?
Yeah, it's a good question. So my understanding, when we've talked to Green Energy Consumer Alliance as well as Green Energy, the CEAs that exist allow people to opt out and then opt back in with no penalty. I don't believe the state statute requires that. And so that could be one of the requirements that we put into the request for proposals. We want people to have the ability to come and go as they can.
Okay. Are there recommended vetted HVAC companies that can help a homeowner with upgrading from gas to heat pumps?
So speaking for the climate action plan, we are not going to get into the vetting of individual HVAC companies. There are organizations that do provide that. And then I know Needham can probably point you to some vendors or resources that can help you evaluate vendors. I'll put a little plug in for our Ed Quinlan, who is doing a lot of pro bono consulting around HVAC for anybody who's interested in heat pumps. So if you know Ed, or if you don't know Ed, reach out to Eleanor and ask her to put you in touch with Ed. He's doing, I had him look at my house and it was fabulous. Like, the expert advice he gave me really helped clarify for me what my options are. And he also has experience with some of the vendors. He doesn't know all of them, but he can speak to a few of them. So.
Okay. Oh, somebody asked if the slideshow is over, can we get rid of the screen?
Oh, yeah, I can stop sharing.
Okay, thank you. Okay. What percentage of towns in Massachusetts have done this already? Could we ever get to a point where counties or the state are negotiating for power? Can the CEA negotiate with more than one provider?
Yeah, great question. So my understanding, 160 communities have a CEA today. Some of them are actually groups of communities that have pooled their purchasing power. I think down in the Falmouth area, for example, there's a number of communities that have pooled their purchasing power. So that's certainly a possibility, and I don't know if it's going to present itself as an opportunity when we move forward. We probably have to find another community that's at the same phase as we are, and willing to agree on goals. So I don't know the answer of whether Needham can do that, but it is possible, and it's certainly allowed by the law. The state is actually already doing it's not a CEA, but the state has something called a renewable what is the I always forget what it's called exactly, but it's basically renewable energy portfolio standard, renewable portfolio standard. That's what it is, RPS, which is where the requirement that the state have 20% of its electricity generated by class 1 renewables. And that'll go up 2% a year over the next several years. So it'll be 22% next year, 24, et cetera. So the state is already doing a lot on this, and the recent bills passed at the state has also required that we start to advance more offshore wind, because one of the challenges with that renewable portfolio standard is that you have to find the electricity, right? We have to have it available for those requirements, and so you need to bring more online. And so the state's been trying to put incentives in to bring more local renewable power online. Otherwise, it's buying renewable power somewhere else in the country, which, yeah, it could help. Certainly does hopefully green the electricity grid across the country, but one of the benefits of requiring it local is it can also help our economy, local jobs here.
Okay.
And then the CA negotiate with more than one provider. No, we'll have to go with one provider, but when we request bids, we should get bids from multiple providers. But we'll have to select a contract with just one.
Okay. Okay. The Green Needham website has an Ask the Expert section, and someone will contact you and walk you through the process. We're doing that now. The expert is extremely helpful. So just clarify or adding some information to what you said. And she went on to say, Ed is amazing. That's who's helping us out.
Yeah,
And he actually helped us out too. So it was fabulous.
Yeah, it's amazing what he's doing, and his expertise is great.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that is all the questions. This has just been amazing. And I wish I'm so happy to hear all that Needham is beginning to do. Wish it had happened 20 years ago, but we'll take whatever we have. So, but we really appreciate all of your efforts, Stephen, and you're helping make Needham a better place. And we thank you for coming tonight. We really appreciate it.
Well,
So, and again, if people want to be on the mailing list, please just add your name and your website to the chat. I'll stay on for a couple minutes. So I will be happy to send you out notices about future Lyceums. So thank you so much.
Thank you.